I'm here with Julie Hood, Global Deputy Vice Chair of Transactional Services at EY. Julie, you've got a lot of experience of cross-border transactions, but also particularly activist interventions at various companies across the world, in particular in Asia. So what do you see as the trend happening over there?
That's right, Jonathan. For the duration of my career at EY over the last 15 years, I've had the pleasure of the last 7 of those being across the Asia Pacific. And then perhaps a backwater by comparison with Europe and the US, which we've heard of a lot about the conversations of today's discussions. You know, Asia Pacific is on the rise with regard to activism. So over the last 2 years, we've seen a doubling in activism sort of campaigns and progress. Now, the number is still relatively small, but I think the trend is very, very important. In particular across Singapore, across parts of China, which is an interesting case probably to delve into a little bit more, but across those Asian countries, activism is certainly on the rise.
And why is that? Is that simply the Americans are coming into Asia, or is it actually Chinese and local activist firms?
Look, predominantly it is still the US intervention, I suppose, around activism, but we are seeing a rise of local activists across the Asian network. And if we delve into why, let's take sort of some scenarios. You know, China has very publicly talked about its intention to have a number of its state-owned enterprises or its privately owned enterprises pretty much perform on the global stage. And they're assessing against the Fortune 500 or 1,000 is almost a measure of success. So with that sort of global stage comes an opportunity for activists to certainly test the waters in those sort of traditional cultures and see where activism can change some of the behaviours or strategic direction of those entities.
And talking of cultures, I mean, those cultures are very traditional. Very often in Asia you'll find they're very different from one another, but how is the encroachment, if you like, of the Western culture actually affecting the way they the makeup of the boards, how boards react to activist approaches?
Well, certainly it's a little bit like when we've seen the aggressiveness, I suppose, of the US activism come into parts of Europe. It's had to tailor itself because of the cultural differences. You know, that is probably intensified as we're seeing activism come into parts of Asia who have very much a closed door, you know, not very confrontational because of their underlying cultures. However, we're certainly seeing the rise of a number of those back in the background sort of conversations, and many that are starting to be almost test cases play out in the press, but very much in its early infancy. You know, what we are seeing that a lot of the cases, albeit with, you know, US intervention, are focusing on some of the board makeup. But I think, quite frankly, as a mechanism to sort of infiltrate some of those entities. In particular, where if you look at a lot of the boards historically in parts of Asia, they are very traditional, but they probably also need to think about the diversity of their makeup. And there's clearly a lot of debate around gender diversity from a global perspective, but across parts of Asia, it's very much also across broader diversity, including the diversity of thought that's coming to the table to influence the strategic direction. So beyond gender, but very much around tradition, ageists, and perhaps representing minorities, in which many of the new shareholders in these businesses are starting to sort of change the dynamics of the businesses.
And it is actually being effective, or is it simply that outsiders would like it to happen? Look,
it's early days, but I think it's often a segue into those conversations. So, and I think, you know, as in particular China, I mean, China's a big market to think about, you know, because the government has put out there that it really wants to play on the global stage, and it is indeed, you know, some of the largest companies in the world are state-owned enterprises in China, but in order for them to be assessed in that sort of world stage, they need to be comfortable in thinking about how they'll be assessed and how they'll be challenged across their businesses. And look, activism has a role to play in that.
Julia, thank you very much indeed.
You're most welcome, Jonathan. Thank you.